everyone. Welcome to this wonderful Pindrop webinar with the very fantastic Dr. Lewis Williams. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started into it. We have got live captioning again today. Now, for the captioning, down on your screen on the bottom right-hand side is a CC button. Click on that for the closed captioning. Because it is live, there is a little bit of a time delay, so it will be a couple of seconds later coming in with the captioning. Also, as we go through the webinar today, towards the end of the webinar, there is a chance to ask Lewis any questions you may have. You can either use the chat button down on the bottom left-hand side, or the Q&A button, which is just beside the captioning button. And I will apologize as well for my accent at times. Lewis has warned me she may ask me to repeat myself. So I think many people have issues with my Northern Irish accent. So hopefully you will all manage to understand as I enunciate some words. So welcome, Lewis. A little bit about Lewis. So today we're talking to cochlear implant user and advocate, Dr. Lewis Williams, whose paper, which was entitled Untreated, Severe to Profound Hearing Loss and the Cochlear Implant Situation, How Policy and Practice Are Disabling New Zealand Society, was published last year in the New Zealand Medical Journal. Lewis will be discussing with us today the importance of advocacy in a time when funding for cochlear implants for adults is at crisis levels in New Zealand, and what her own experiences of severe hearing loss have taught her. Lewis grew up on Tamaki Makaurau's North Shore. Did I pronounce that right, Lewis?
Yeah, pretty good, Nick.
She recently returned to Aotearoa after many years living in Canada, and today lives in Tauranga Moana. She is of Ngātauranga descent. Initially diagnosed with progressive hearing loss 22 years ago, today Lewis lives with severe to profound hearing loss. Initially qualifying as a social worker and community developer, she went on to work in the public health and tertiary sectors. Her PhD was in empowerment theory and focused on issues of identity, culture, and power. Today, she is an independent scholar practitioner and the founding director of the Alliance of Intergenerational Resilience. She loves hiking, as you can tell by her background, meditation, yoga, and drama, te reo Māori, and spending time with family and friends. So lovely to have you along with us today, Lewis. And I think what we'll start with, Lewis, is going back 22 years ago. What was it like for you when you first started losing your hearing, and what impact did that have on your life at the time?
Okay, sure. Yeah, well, just kia ora tātou, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you today. My jungle background is actually part of the Tauranga Moana, up o Tanewanuku, in case you're wondering. But I'm actually not there now. Anyway, Nick, to get to your question, so what was it like? Well, I was actually, I was 31, 32 when I began to notice changes in my hearing. I'm now 59, and so that was around 93, and I wasn't too concerned at first, but to cut a long story short, in 97, at the age of 36, after wearing hearing aids, at first in my left ear and then a little bit in my right ear as well, started to go, I was diagnosed, I was told by the audiologist that I had a progressive hearing loss and I could lose my hearing altogether. So hearing this news, after, it slowly going down, then experiencing a sudden dramatic drop at age 36, it had a profound impact on me. It was very traumatic to be told that I would likely lose a major sensory capacity altogether, and that maybe one day far in the future a cochlear implant might be possible. So yeah, it was pretty traumatic, and I think hearing, everyone can tell if someone is visually impaired, but when we are hearing impaired or deaf, it's the great invisible condition. It's an invisible condition, and people go, well, the person, you look fine, you're navigating your way around fine, but the impacts are invisible, and so I think the trauma is actually compounded in that way. So for me, it was, I was working as a social worker at the time. I was looking at doing my PhD and trying to get the funds together. And so my work was all about people. And it was just like, well, what am I going to do now? How is life going to be? So I was, there was, some of my friends were great. Other people, because it was invisible, couldn't understand, and they couldn't understand my emotional response. So it kind of had a pretty, I think deafness is quite misunderstood because of the invisibility. So I will say it did fracture some of my relationships. Luckily, I went along to the Hearing Association, and it was interesting because the audiologist who referred me, he was a really nice person, but he didn't understand the emotional impacts. And a friend of mine who was a social worker, we went back to talk to him and said, don't you realise the emotional impacts? Like, what am I supposed to do? Anyway, eventually I got referred to the Hearing Association, and there was a wonderful woman there who taught me she started teaching me lip reading skills, and really importantly, communication skills in terms of asking people to change their behaviours so that I had a better chance at understanding what was going on. I think, the other thing I would say, thinking about the impacts. So the impacts went on for a long time before I finally got to the implant stage, and then finally got the implant. But I realised I wrote a poem about some of my experiences and the process of losing my hearing post-implant. And a friend of mine who's a therapist looked at the poem, and because I'm going through various ages and stages and what my experience was then. And she said, that's episodic grief. What I read, and because, life changes, each life stage is different. And so, once again, you encounter these new situations, and you're also dealing with a changing situation I was in terms of my hearing. And so there's the grief returns. Yeah, so that was really interesting. So there's a lot more things I could say about that, and the impacts on me. I'm also the kind of person, I certainly didn't want the hearing loss, and I wanted to be able just to get on with my life. So there was also a fair bit of denial as well, and because I just kind of wanted to push on. So there was always that operating. As the loss got worse and started to really, because it takes a fair bit of confidence to actually ask people to change their communication behaviour.
A lot.
And, and people can get quite pissed off. Yeah, you've got to be quite careful, continually trying to call it. Yeah. In work meetings, how much am I going to ask people to change their behaviours? So that was kind of interesting as well. And each life stage is different. So navigating this trajectory, from 31, 32 through to 58 when I finally got the implant, there were different issues at each age. So I'll stop it there, but that's basically some of the impacts.
I mean, they were huge, and you have covered, the strategies that you used that really implemented from the Hearing Association, your lip reading and the confidence to ask people to change their communication strategies, which is really a really fantastic thing that you could do. But as you said, really challenging to do it, because people's frustrations because hearing people, as you said, were quite lazy, and it's, and then tend to switch off and don't understand. I mean, as an academic, you talked about going on to do your PhD. How did you achieve that? Because it must have been exceptionally difficult with the hearing loss that you had in your career? How did you navigate that in your career, Lewis?
Yeah, well, at the time, when the dramatic loss kicked in, I just kind of got the funds together to start my PhD. I was just getting there. And it was community development work with Tongan and Samoan women. And it was tough. They were fabulous to work with. But because a lot of it was facilitation. But I could still hear better in those days than I could when I actually got the implant. But there was a lot of extra energy and effort, you know, and it's very relational. If you have good relationships with people, they will make that energy, they will put the extra energy in. But but if you don't know people very well,
yeah,
they're not going to put that energy in. So as I went through my career, I guess I gradually got more and more limited in what I could do. So, you know, so I went on and I went into academia, became a university professor, but then what actually happens is that it's really what you don't get asked to do, because no one's going to come up to you and say, oh, look, you're so deaf, we're going to exclude you from this. You know, they think to themselves, oh no, Lewis Williams wouldn't be able to be on that panel because she's not going to be able to hear. Or, I think it's going to be a bit much trouble to get her to be on this committee because she can't do a phone call. You know, so you realize after a while, it's actually what you're not being asked to do. And the other thing I would say, you know, getting older and, you know, I became increasingly aware of ageism, right? So I was young when this started and thinking, oh yeah, okay, they're going to think, oh, this woman doesn't have too many years to work. We're not going to worry about her, kind of thing. So I was always aware of that with the audiologists. But I just want to go back to the work environment. I'm also in a neoliberal work environment where, you know, so it's not, we don't live with the same amount of state infrastructure that when I was younger, you know. And so basically businesses and workplaces do not have the same amount of cushioning to be able to accommodate people with disabilities. So I became increasingly aware of, okay, I better not make this the employer's problem. I need to convince them that I can deal with this, you know. So that's a fair bit of pressure when you think about the type of work environment these days. You know, so I became pretty strategic, you know, and how I managed it, you know. And then you know, there's times when it's just so obvious that you can't hear.
So on that, sorry, Lewis, go on.
I was just going to give, so in one workplace, I had a really good there was no way that I could even, before I got the implant, that I could even do Team Skypes, right? And so one of my workmates was really kind and she would text me what people were saying, you know, and so I could keep up. And it almost sort of, it makes, when I think about that, so it was very kind, but it also makes me a bit, but to have that level of dependence on someone as well, to have that level of dependence. Yeah. So anyway, it has definitely influenced my career, my work, and my relationships.
So then when you're going back now to the point of, how did you find out about cochlear implant? How did you get referred to the program? Because you had some challenges, I think, back then, you know, because you originally started to fundraise because you weren't sure if you would be eligible for an implant. So what was your journey to now getting the implant you've got now?
Okay, so the journey was that I actually had invested in a Roger pen That's it. So I had two hearing aids, and I was trying to use this Roger Penn microphone, and it
Yeah.
was becoming less and less effective. And I was going back and back to the audiologist, and I think during that time my hearing was continuing to drop. My right ear was more or less deaf, and my left ear was deaf, and my right ear was more or less deaf. And finally, he said, well, I said, what are the options? And he said, well, there are cochlear implants, but you wouldn't qualify because you still have too much hearing in your right ear. And anyway, the next thing that happened was I got a massive ear infection. It's actually very stressful being deaf, the amount of energy you're putting in. So I'll talk about the health impacts later. But there's a situation that occurred at work where I got an ear infection, and even in the hearing aid, even in the ear where the hearing aid was giving me a little bit of benefit, I couldn't fit a hearing aid into that ear. So I had to fly home from work. I was supposed to be in a 3 or 4 day hui. And so they'd flown me down. I had to fly back. Because I was useless. And I was just desperate. And so I went back to the audiologist. I said, look, you said something to me that there's a company that's now starting to do these privately. They're doing it privately and it's cheaper. Tell me about this company because I just have to get this implant. And so he told me about this company, and then I met with the company, took a friend along with me to so she could write down what they were saying. And then so at that point, I was so desperate. I just thought, right, I've got to get that money. I don't have the money personally. I'm going to fundraise. So then I opened up a crowd fundraising page. And the next thing I know is that I get this email from Hearing House. And Hearing House says, our communications officer came across your fundraising page. We think you may be eligible for an implant. Would you like to get a referral for an assessment? So I thought, oh, well, okay, I guess I better play the game. But as far as I know, there's not a hope in hell I'm going to get an implant through the public system. So I said, yes, okay, thank you very much. I'll come for an assessment. And then so I got the referral and went for an assessment. And I took my mother and sister. And, so I'm trained in public health, and I also know how funding is rationed. So I was pretty, I have to say, I was a bit defensive and kind of wasn't expecting too much from this assessment. And then at the end, Caroline goes, well, you do qualify. And my memory is, she said, of course, it has to go before the committee, but probably you would be really high priority, and it would be someone who would also be blind and deaf who would be ahead of you if they were yeah. So, well, and I remember during the assessment, it's pretty intense, and there was a couple of times, I just went out for a bit of a break, just that kind of, because I think my denial levels were also still, denial is a defense, right? And so the assessment really brought up for me also, how much I couldn't hear as well.
Yeah.
So that I also understand though that my speech, my hearing loss is a bit unusual and it has a lot of rollover. So the audiologist didn't understand that part of it because I think the audiologist I saw was a pretty conscientious person. But I do think there's a massive problem with people not getting referred.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have heard that anecdotally with other clients over the years about, getting timely referrals, through, and it's, I suppose, because there is a perception of the lack of funding, and that does bring us to the point, as you said, like funding in New Zealand for CI, has been at crisis level for some time now. And like currently we have 230 people on a waiting list for 40 publicly funded implants.
Yeah.
It's growing by 50 to 60 adults a year. And that baseline hasn't really increased in this last 6 years. We've had one-off funding hits, as you know. And last year, Lewis, you wrote a phenomenal paper, which we're going to come to now to discuss, which was published in the New Zealand Medical Journal about access to cochlear implants. And so, like, what was it about your experience that motivated you to write the paper, which is Untreated, Severe to Profound Hearing Loss in the Cochlear Implant Situation? How policy and practice are disabling New Zealand society. What motivated you?
If I'm really honest, it was initially about self-survival.
Yeah.
And I actually was writing to the Disability Commissioner. So it wasn't initially for an article. And I just decided, right, I have to start. I just thought I have to have an implant, and I have to start to mount an argument as to why implants are necessary. And so, and then of course, research being one of my things, then once I got into that, and once I started, reading, because deafness is not one of my areas in terms of my, formal training, right? So then, as I started to get into it and I started to read what the issues were, and then of course, so I thought, well, maybe I'll put together a self-case study together with what the rest of the evidence is saying about the situation. And then, being of Ngāti Rangi descent and working in the area of Māori health and self-determination, Indigenous self-determination, then of course, other dimensions began to be added to that. Yeah, but so that's how I came to do it.
Yeah, because in your opening comments of your paper, Lewis, which I just find your paper phenomenal. It's a fantastic read, which we will be putting up on the website to accompany this talk afterwards. You discuss how deaf people have less societal power. So can you explain how that actually occurs when you discuss about societal power?
Sure. Okay. I have to say I will comment, but my PhD thesis was around identity, power and culture.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's given me a wonderful lens to come to the culture of disability with as well, and how that compares to mainstream culture. But so societal power, to break it down, I think it operates in two main ways, material power and social power. So in terms of the deaf community, obviously, there's less economic power because you cannot compete in the mainstream job situations. There's high rates of unemployment. So, your material power, your access to income, your access to housing, your access to affordable food, healthcare, that is compromised. And then social power, well, we live in a hearing world where a lot of the communication is verbal. So if you were not able to connect to people and to social systems, and you've got to think about social status as well. Because social status partly it comes from who you know, it comes from your social networks, it comes from your position, it comes from how people perceive you. And if you cannot, so when you're in a good job, you can say, oh, I'm going to get my mate to do so and so, right? But if you're already at the margins, you do not have you don't have those social networks for a start. And then also there was something else I was going to say, but there's also the way that you're perceived, right? So deafness is confused often with stupidity. Oh, she doesn't get it. So, but also there's all those kinds of conversations that you might have, quick conversations where you might pick up the phone and say to someone, oh, what do you think about that? And but deaf people don't have that kind of access. So, social power and material power is really compromised, and also just access to education, which gives you social and material power as well. So I think that's how the power dimension. It's multidimensional in that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's hugely insightful, Lewis, because oftentimes we don't actually think about those elements that you've discussed in giving us power, and how your sensory disability takes that away from you, and the impacts it actually has is much bigger than just at an individual level. It's the ripple effect from the micro to the macro, isn't it, really, from society?
It absolutely is. And I remember, there was one day when I was really frustrated, and and this is when I was told there was just, kind of basically, if I was going to get the implant, I would need to be raising those funds. And I said to the audiologist, I said, you know what? I said, a lot of people who were deaf haven't had good access to education. But I said, you know what? I said, I'm educated. And I'm going to try and use that to, and that is when I set about writing the paper.
Yeah, which has done a phenomenal job, Lewis. I mean, you've given such a strong voice to this issue, for others, coming through in this journey. It's a phenomenal piece of work. Like, it's in the paper you talk about, how policy and practice are disabling New Zealand society. So can you expand a little bit on that point as well, Lewis, please?
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, in terms of policy and practice, so we know it's very hard to get a publicly funded cochlear implant in this country. So the criteria are extremely tighter, more stringent than other countries, and so there's often a big gap between someone's suitability for implant. From what I understand of the research, implants are shown to be very successful for people with this. They're a very successful health intervention for people with this type of hearing loss. And yet, there's a huge gap between people who are suitable and a number of people who are getting them. So that is the first thing I would say. But also, even if there's lots of loopholes. So had I acquired my hearing through my hearing loss through an accident, I may be covered under ACC. If I wanted something like, if this was the elective surgery guidelines in New Zealand mean that people with not a life-threatening condition, but a condition that definitely needs fixing, a serious condition, whether that could be a hip replacement or something else, should get treated within 4 months. Those are the guidelines. But there's no such aim for people who have severe to profound deafness, who could benefit from the treatment of a cochlear implant. So clearly this is inequitable. And so when I, chose that title for the paper, how New Zealand, what is the title again?
It's going back. It's Untreated severe to profound hearing loss in the cochlear implant situation. How policy and practice are disabling New Zealand society.
Okay, so I thought, right, thank you. It's a long title, but I thought, so clearly, not only is this disabling, people and given what I've said, what people go through who, experience severe to profound deafness over a long time, not only is this disabling for them, because if you look at the trajectory of what happens to health when you have deafness, right? So for a start, there's a lot of, so I've already mentioned about that the income disparities, the social disparities, you know, and how that leads to less access to material, the social determinants of health or forms of power. But also, in fact, the psychosocial processes that go on, right, and the stress that's created, right. So you can get issues like cognitive decline, which I started to notice my memory issues with my memory starting to occur, and that's actually when I decided I thought this is a perfect time to try and learn Te Reo Māori, right. But that's another, because I need something that's gonna, you know. But that the brain really wants to hear, and so there's the depression you're hiding away, but there's also clear pathways between psychosocial stresses and physical changes in the body, because when you're stressed, your cortisol levels are raised. Yep, and so that also can lead to. I'm not a medical doctor. But I've studied this stuff in the past in terms of health determinants, and I know that there's a whole body of literature on it that this leads to hypertension, could lead to heart conditions. So it impacts the physical and the psychological are very related. And I do know that before I got the implant, my health was going down in terms of the continual stress, and I was having a number of physical symptoms as well. So that's the bit in terms of how it's disabling people who need the implant. But it's also disabling New Zealand society as a whole, because we're not getting to make the contributions that we could be making, whether that be parenting, whether that be caring for others, whether that be being the kind of friend we want to be, whether that's in our work. So New Zealand society is missing out big time from the contributions these people could be making.
Yeah, because you mentioned that, you mentioned in your paper, I'll pull out some quotes that you managed to find. The total cost of hearing loss in New Zealand in 2016 was estimated at 4.9 billion, comprising of 957.3 million in financial costs and 3 billion in terms of loss of well-being. And I mean, you did an example, Lewis, as well, where you said for your own situation,
Sure.
Your own situation. So your taxes pay, so a contribution with your CI and your ability to retain your work. So taxes paid at $35,000 a year. Your KiwiSaver contributions at $14,000. So your total contribution to New Zealand society from an economics point of view, $48,000. Now, with job loss as a result of untreated hearing loss, so the state would pay you in sickness benefit $15,000. Extra healthcare costs cost them another $5,000. So the loss of your taxes at $48,000. So the total cost to the state then $68,000. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's like, so it makes much more economic sense to get you implanted earlier, to make sure you can have, not just stay employed, but have your productivity, because your productivity must also drop while you're waiting to get an implant, while you're struggling to hear. I would assume that would also happen as well.
Yes, it does. I have to say, I thought, of course, this is just the contribution in conventional economic terms. So it is not taking in the social contribution, at all. But to me, I mean, this is nonsensical. We know this intervention works well, and it's, and I've laid this out in very simple terms, what the costs are of not giving someone an implant, and they exceed the cost of the implant within the first year. Well, in my case, they exceed the cost of the implant within the first year. And, while you are waiting for that implant, of course, it's very hard to be as productive when you cannot hear and the stress that's going into trying to hear, and the hopelessness and the hiding away. And because these are all strategies that we adopt.
Yeah, because you do say that. I mean, that was just from the purely economic, but from the social and personal perspective, like your own like journey that you used as a case study, I said it's just not that's the pure economics, but you know, can you sort of, you know, I know you've touched on it previously, but what was the impact on your life, you know, as on coming up to you getting an implant? So can you highlight a bit more? You have already sort of covered a bit.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add about your experiences?
Well, I think increasingly, you know, I would hide away. I would not, because it's just so hard in going into social situations. And you know, I would have a strategy. I would say, all right, I need people contact, so I'm going to go to this gathering for 1 hour. And that's going to be my maximum of what I can take of their embarrassment of I cannot hear people and I cannot connect, you know. It had impacts with my family, obviously. You know, I'm a daughter, a sister, an auntie, you know, friend, and so it had you know, stresses there. And you know, I remember hearing at the assessment, and my sister said, well, you know, it's really hard for my sister to participate at family gatherings, and she can't really, you know, do this. You know, my mum's now 85, so I couldn't pick up the phone and call my mother, you know. That's a huge thing. There were times, my friends were really good, but there were times when it causes stresses. I would, you know, and also because other people, they're in a sense they're carrying you in different situations. I started because of, you know, my whakapapa, I started learning te reo Māori, and I was really determined. But it was pretty hard. It caused stress for everybody, you know. And I just thought, no, I'm like, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to stay home? Like, and just stare at the walls? And because I wanted it so bad, you know. But there were times, in the first, you know, it was difficult for everybody.
Yeah.
So there were, you know, there were lots of impacts, and cumulative over time. And I, you know, because I'll leave it at that, but definitely cumulative over time.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Lewis. So we'll just go on a couple of other points that you raised in your paper. So what you've written that contravenes, you know, a number of public policies and principles. So one of them was, and you can expand a bit on this, I think you've mentioned it before, equal access to health services due to lack of parity with both elective surgery wait times and those who have access CI treatment through ACC legislation. You've already spoken about that. But then you also speak about, for Māori, the right to retain and practice their Māori cultural heritage through accessing te reo Māori classes, including the right to special provision of Indigenous persons with disabilities under Section 22 of the UNDRIP. Do you want to expand a little bit on that, Lewis?
Sure. Well, in generally, so Māori, not so much in this, I understand, I'm not an expert, but not so much in the severe to the profound ranges, but Māori have much higher rates of hearing loss in the mild to moderate, but also because of lower incomes, even when Māori would, you know, benefit from hearing aids, cochlear implants technology, because of socioeconomic issues and wealth disparities, Māori are less able to access the type, you know, hearing aids or types of assistive devices that can help with hearing. So there are huge disparities, and the in terms of the Treaty of Waitangi, the Crown was actually found to be in breach of that regarding health last year, and so clearly under the treaty and te tino rangatiratanga and self-determination and the right to be well and practice one's culture and access to reo Māori, those rights are being denied. And even if you think about the way health services are structured and hearing services are part of the health services, then there's a raft of we still have institutional racism.
Yeah.
That is a fact, and so that is also going to be affecting Māori who are experiencing deafness as well. So in terms of the right, language is considered to be a taonga. Te reo Māori is a taonga, and so if in terms of not being able to access a really important part of one's cultural identity, within an already inherently Pākehā dominated society or racist society, that's another added thing on top of the deafness. And then I was surprised to see, because I started looking at Pindrop, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Yeah.
And so, I'm just reading here now, but it says particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities in the implementation of this declaration. So I'm not an expert in Pindrop, but it was really interesting to see that there. And being Māori research and working in Māori public health, and because a lot of the settings are community-based and at marae, and kanohi kikinohi, face-to-face, but in noisy settings, and where face-to-face is, everything in that communication, you can't just sit on an email.
Yeah.
So the challenges there, are actually added, and I know that there are a lot of Māori who are deaf who, for many reasons, will not come forward or access the services.
Yeah, you've also, with them also being denied access, you did a petition this year as well, calling for better access to CI, and again, I think you mentioned in your paper about, under the Human Rights Act as well, discrimination there as well. Lewis, what was your thoughts on that in relation to access to cochlear implants in New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. Well, I understand. And I found this out through my research. But that, so New Zealand is a signatory on the rights of people with on the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And by being a signatory to that, New Zealand aims to be a non-disabling society, a place where people with disabilities have equal opportunities to achieve their goals and aspirations. But additionally, I understand that it is the Human Rights Act that legislation covers people with disabilities, and that the 1993 Human Rights Act makes discrimination against people with disabilities unlawful, particularly in the public education and health sectors.
Yeah.
So and that there is an onus not to prevent further disabilities from occurring. So clearly, this is not happening within the way that health services for cochlear implant potential recipients are being rolled out. And the way that this is working at the moment is that potential recipients, because of the excessively long waiting times, and I know for some people the time has passed, but that there are comorbidity factors, other health factors that are linked to the hearing loss start to set in. So I don't think that the government, New Zealand government, is meeting its obligations there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I mean, on many facets, they are failing. People who desperately need CI in New Zealand. That is for sure, and has been feeling them for many years now. But after your paper was published, Lewis, and we had the Cochlear Implant Forum last year that you spoke at, you also had the opportunity to meet with Minister Salisi down in Wellington. So would you want to let us know how that went and what points were raised with them at that meeting?
The actual meeting went really well, and it was I would say it was enjoyable, and it felt a very connected meeting. And is it Minister Salisi?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I enjoyed meeting her very much, and some of the team there. What was a mystery to me is that we understood there would be. This was in November of last year, and we understood another meeting. Minister Salisi said, "Well, I need to talk to my colleagues and the Minister of Health," and we understood a meeting would be held the following February. However, the line kind of went dead. Nice. After that, and that was not so positive. There's a part of me that says, well, this is the way politics works. Who knows what's going on? And then there's another part of me that says, well, hey, come on. This is, okay, there may be bigger fish to fry there, whatever's happening, but it's also good practice.
Yeah.
To come back and say, well, this is where it's got to now, even if it's not the result you want. So that was, the gap was a bit disappointing.
I mean, it's, I think that's the thing, Lewis, isn't it? Where sometimes we can get disillusioned and disengaged and think, our efforts are going nowhere. Ooh. And it's very easy to sort of give up in many ways your advocacy and not have a voice or you let your voice go quiet. But that's something that definitely should not happen. I think you need to shout your voice even louder. What is your advice to, because we've got an amazing group of consumers out in New Zealand, some have had their implants. What is your advice to them, about keeping going on and things that, we can be doing as a community, collectively with consumers and with the health professionals and everybody involved? What would your advice be?
My advice would be actually have fun. Sounds a fun, but try and make this enjoyable for yourself. Because there are times when it can be, a hard slog. Work together. It is incremental. Policy change is often incremental. It can also be opportunistic. Magic can happen.
Yeah.
Work collectively. Work as a group. Don't work by yourself. Try and keep the bigger picture in mind, and really maintain the relationships with everybody. And I think there are some creative ways of coming at this that aren't just about putting pen to paper or being interviewed. So I think there are different types of expression, and these are all valid, and and everyone has a, you may feel that, okay, I'm not so good at speaking out or something, but there'll be another area that you're strong in, and so it's about the collective contribution, and how we do this journey together. So those are the things that I would say, just kind of would off the cuff. Yeah, and I'm aware there's been some amazing people, slogging away at this, and pushing this barrow for years. And it's like, okay, so population-wise, it's a relatively small group of people, although we know that many people are not being referred. But but this is treatable, and the impacts of it not being treatable, they ripple out, and not being treated, they ripple out into many areas. So it's a really important area of advocacy.
Yeah, I mean, and we can't thank you enough, you know, Lewis, and for everybody that over the years continues to advocate really well, and that is from, you know, those who've had an implant, those who are waiting, the health professionals, the researchers, the surgeons, you know, the trusts involved north and south, you know, everybody's coming together, you know, and they've been pushing really hard, and it's not for want of lack of trying and to give it a voice, but as you said, you've got to keep going, and results do eventually happen, you know what I mean, and it's the squeaky wheel, but it's the fact of never giving up, because you will always need to continue to make changes, to make improvements. And I think in an area where it's so easy to lose your voice in one, because, you know, and withdraw into yourself because of the disability that you're living with is really hard. But, you know, we can't, you know, thank you enough for all your efforts and what you've been doing, between the wonderful paper, you know, the petition. It's, yeah, you've been doing amazing work, Lewis.
I've met some great people, you know, and it was really, I really loved coming together November last year at the symposium.
Yeah.
You know, and meeting the other implantees, but also those waiting, the really dedicated professionals, some of the students, the advocates, such as yourself, such as Lee, like all these people who, you know, are working in this. It was I really loved coming to that and meeting everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think the symposium, we hold that biannually now, and we started a thing about, we've done 3 now, and next year will be our 4th one. I think it's definitely been, you know, the jewel in the crown in many ways of bringing people together collectively throughout, you know, and connecting, and ideas are formed, and, you know, the support's wonderful. Now, Lewis, I do have a couple of questions have popped in here. So we've got one, I think, is a bit about your journey. So Neville has asked, where's his, oh yeah, what was the rehab like, was what Neville wants to know.
Okay. The rehab, Neville, well, it was pretty good. And for me, it was pretty quick, but I was, so, you know, I mean, I'll start off, so I woke up, I had a bit of a sore head, but it, you know, not too bad. And then I was staying at Mum's, and the next day I started practicing, well, maybe 2 days later, straight away. And Mum, actually, I'll describe it, you know, and Mum, and at first I was going, what's that noise? And she'd go, oh, that's, what do you think it is? I say, well, maybe is that a car on the road? And I heard like a ticking of the clock, and, you know, and then I started practicing words, and I really wanted to, you know, I just have to say the practice was really important, and reworking, learning to rework that part of my brain was a big thing. There were days, so I would practice every day. I had the speech coach on my phone. I've still got that on my phone for if I want to, for old time's sake more, but I just keep it on there. But so I'd be doing that, you know, so I'd stop, have morning tea, and I'd do that do practice several times a day, just for 10 minutes. I think I do remember that I was pretty tired at first, and I remember there was going along to Te Reo Māori class maybe 3 weeks later, and I was going, oh my God, I can hear that person across the room. I haven't heard the person across the room for I can understand what they're saying. I haven't heard this for years. But then I can remember I was trying to make sense of the sounds as well. And I can remember that the teacher didn't really understand what was happening with me, the kāko, and he came along, because I was just satisfied I was beginning to hear. And he came along, he said, and he kind of said something that it was just a bit too much. And also I realised that there were times when I I overdid it, and I was overstimulated. I just had this massive headache, I remember, and I had to sleep for several hours, right? So I had to pace myself, you know, because I was so happy I could hear better. But yes, I really, otherwise, if I didn't pace myself, I could, there was one day I think I had to sleep for half a day. I was just, you know, so I had to really manage that. And then also, you know, then also there's sort of coming to, because I can hear in so many more situations, I also forget about the situations I can't hear, and where I do still have to actually ask for modifications. One thing that's been interesting, I think I've had to read, I think with the deafness, it's made me more of an introvert. And so I think I have to retrain myself to also like pick up the phone and call friends. And, you know, because no one called Lewis for years because, well, you couldn't have a phone conversation with her. So I'm aware of actually trying to retrain some of my habits. But I'm over a year out now. There's still changes going on with my hearing. I'm not sure.
Well, thanks for that, Lewis. I think we're going to have to wrap it up. We're nearly at 1 o'clock, and
right.
People have got to get back to their working days, so that many have come on in their lunch breaks. This will be recorded. You know, it is recorded, so we will be getting it edited and put up on the Pindrop website for those that haven't, you know, seen it. And we'll have a link to your wonderful paper, Lewis, that I would advise everybody to have a read of, because it is a phenomenal paper. And onwards and upwards from here, Lewis, for more wonderful advocacy and better outcomes for adults with severe to profound hearing loss that need access to a cochlear implant. And thank you for all you've been doing.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to the community and this opportunity.
Wonderful, Lewis. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Ciao for now. Bye bye.
Okay.